Hello fellow bibliophiles, and welcome back to Blatantly Bookish. I'm Marissa, and today I can't wait to chat with you all about illustrations in Victorian literature, and specifically illustrations within Charles Dickens's work and his relationship with illustration in general. I started thinking about this topic when I was flipping through my copy of David Copperfield and realized that there are sadly no illustrations whatsoever in my edition. Illustrations are something that I've come to expect in a lot of Victorian books, but specifically in Dickens. I just love illustrations in Victorian literature. They add another layer of meaning and interpretation to the text, and as a very visual person, I'm really drawn to them. It's one of the things that stands out about literature from this time period to me and just makes it that much more special. In the 19th century, the advances in printing technologies such as steel and wood engraving and lithography allowed illustrations to be included in mass-produced books. Because of these techniques, the illustrations in Victorian literature are these very distinctive black and white images, often associated with lots of detailed line work and cross-hatching. They're really stunning works of art in their own right, and the illustrations usually depict major plot points or important scenes within the text that really enhances the reading experience. And because so many Victorian novels were originally serialized publications, being released in sections within newspapers, magazines, and periodicals, they naturally lend themselves to illustration. There are so many Victorian authors who incorporated illustrations into their books. Some, like William Thackeray and Edward Lear, illustrated their own works themselves, and others, like Dickens and Hardy and Lewis Carroll, collaborated with talented illustrators of the time period. It's really interesting to focus on Dickens in particular, though, because of his unique relationships with so many different illustrators, as well as his influence in the Victorian publishing world. Dickens worked unusually close with his illustrators. He chose the topics for each illustration and gave very strict and detailed direction to his artists. He would make the artists revise the images until he was satisfied that they conveyed the exact ideas he wanted them to. He had so much control over and input into these illustrations that his communications with his illustrators and the final products both give fascinating insights into his own notions and interpretations of his works and characters. The drawings in Dickens's novels were also circulated on their own and functioned as marketing for his works. They helped form a public image of what Dickens's characters were like, and also helped promote and sell copies of his books and magazine articles. Dickens worked with so many illustrators. I'm going to name a whole bunch of them now, but I'm sure that there are others as well missing from this already very long list. He worked with Robert Seymour, George Cattermole, Daniel Maclise, John Leech, Fred Walker, F.W. Palethorpe, William P. Frith, Joseph Clayton Clark, aka Kid, Sir John Gilbert, Alfred Crowquill, Fred Barnard, and John Tenniel, who is of course more well known for his Alice in Wonderland illustrations. But the two illustrators that Dickens is most famous for working with, and the two that I want to focus on a little more in the rest of the video, are George Crookshank and Hablo Knight Brown, better known as Fizz. It's interesting that Crookshank is one of the illustrators that Dickens is best known for working with, considering that Crookshank only illustrated Sketches by Boz and Oliver Twist for Dickens. A lot of the other illustrators' names in the laundry list that I mentioned before actually did just as much, if not more work for Dickens than Crookshank. But I guess Crookshank is more popular for two reasons. He was a very famous illustrator in his own right, and one of the first English artists to make a living in book illustration. And Crookshank and Dickens had a very public rift, full of lots of memorable controversy well after Crookshank stopped illustrating for Dickens. So there is that. George Crookshank came from a family of artists and learned to draw from his father, who was a caricaturist. He originally did political caricatures and political satire along with his brother, but these witty cartoons came to a halt after King George IV summoned the two Crookshank boys and essentially bribed them to stop. Shortly after that, in 1820, Crookshank turned to magazine and book illustration. He illustrated Grimm's fairy tales and Defoe's Robinson Crusoe, among other things, and as a seasoned illustrator, was put in touch with a young Charles Dickens to illustrate sketches by Boz. That went well, and Crookshank again illustrated for Dickens in the serialized Oliver Twist, while both of them were working for Bentley's Miscellany magazine. Apparently, Dickens and Crookshank argued over the final illustration of Oliver Twist, the fireside plate. But Dickens had already resigned his post at that magazine anyway, due to interference in editorial matters. After Crookshank finished Oliver Twist, he didn't illustrate any other serialized Dickens because he had an exclusive contract with Bentley's Miscellany magazine. The real rift between Crookshank and Dickens happened later in 1853 when Dickens published in Household Words criticizing Crookshank's satirical essay called Frauds on the Fairies. The two of them continued to have negative feelings towards each other, especially after Crookshank claimed to have come up with the plot and characters of Oliver Twist. Dickens never recognized Crookshank as a co-creator, and by 1860 the two of them avoided each other on the street. After Dickens died in 1870, and Crookshank was a bit of a has-been, he published a letter in the Times where he again took credit for the idea of most of the plot and characters in Oliver Twist, as a final jab at Dickens. Regardless of his personality, or actions, or accusations, I think Crookshank was an immensely talented artist, and I particularly enjoy his more whimsical work, like his early political satire, and the illustrations he did for Grimm's fairy tales. But when you think of illustrations and Dickens, you are most likely thinking of the artist Hablo Knight Brown, aka Fizz. He's the illustrator who had the longest relationship with Dickens and illustrated the vast majority of his novels. Fizz illustrated 10 out of Dickens's 15 novels, in fact. For years, Fizz's illustrations kept up with Dickens's serialized publishing schedule and were featured on the quintessential green covers that we also associate with Dickens's work. Hablo Knight Brown received his first commission with Dickens in 1836 for a pamphlet called Sunday Under Three Heads. Later in 1836, Brown took over the illustrations of the Pickwick Papers, after the original illustrator, Robert Seymour, committed suicide, and the second illustrator, Robert Buss, wasn't up to Dickens's standards. Some say that Hablo Knight Brown used the synonym Fizz because it worked well with Dickens's nickname Boz. But it's also said that Brown fancied that he created fizzes, or effervescent drafts of humor and caricature. Dickens and Brown formed a close-knit relationship, with Brown even accompanying Dickens and his wife on a trip to Belgium in 1837. Over the course of the next 23 years, Fizz was Dickens's main illustrator, making about 740 illustrations comprised of 570 steel etchings and 170 wood engravings. After a long and prosperous relationship between author and illustrator, Dickens rather abruptly cut ties with Fizz. A Tale of Two Cities was the last book that Fizz illustrated for Dickens, and Brown was apparently surprised and at a loss to know why he was dismissed. There are a lot of theories as to why Dickens severed the relationship with Brown. Some claim that Brown's work was becoming somewhat old-fashioned and that his comic and satiric illustration style no longer meshed with Dickens's later novels as they became darker and more serious. After looking at some of Bleak House's illustrations from 1853, I'm not sure how I feel about that theory, though. Fizz has some phenomenal dark plates in Bleak House that seem pretty grim and serious to me. Plus, even Dickens's later works aren't completely devoid of humor and levity. Others say that Dickens might have felt that Fizz's work for a different periodical, Once a Week, was drawing the illustrator's focus and attention away from A Tale of Two Cities. Interestingly, that periodical, Once a Week, was put together by Dickens's old publishers, Bradbury and Evans, which he stopped working with around the same time he stopped working with Fizz. And then some believe that Dickens felt that Brown didn't give him the appropriate support when Dickens decided to leave his wife. Valerie Brown Lester, the great-great-granddaughter and biographer of Hablo Knight Brown, wrote on this matter. Dickens's personal revolution mirrored the people's revolution in A Tale of Two Cities. Like a snake sloughing off old skin, he was shedding his past and fighting for a new life. He shed decorum and fell in love. He shed his wife and angrily dismissed those friends who showed her any sympathy. Ruthlessly and acrimoniously, he shed his publishers, Bradbury and Evans. He shed restraint and plunged headlong into an exhausting but enormously profitable series of readings. All of the discussion around the end of Dickens's and Brown's relationship seems to involve Dickens's changing life and attitudes towards his own work. For whatever specific reason, or perhaps for a combination of the reasons previously discussed, Brown no longer fit into Dickens's vision of the future. And it's even been posited that Dickens might have lost his interest in illustration altogether around that time period, as the book after A Tale of Two Cities, which is Great Expectations, had a first volume edition with no illustrations at all. Brown had a fruitful career and illustrated for many other authors, mostly Charles Lever and Harrison Ainsworth, but also other authors like Fielding, Smollett, Halse, and Mayhew. He also illustrated Can You Forgive Her by Anthony Trollope. Brown's work was in demand by publishers until he had a stroke in 1867, which impaired his illustrating abilities. After that, he didn't do any more etchings, but remarkably, he made a slow recovery from his stroke and continued to provide illustrations for publishers until his death in 1882. Dickens, of course, went on to use a handful of other illustrators in his later works. I think it's really interesting to look at Dickens's novels through the lens of their illustrations and his relationships with illustrators. The illustrations in Dickens's novels really do shed light into Dickens's perceptions of his plots and characters, what Dickens felt was important enough to be illustrated, and specifically the direction he gave to the illustration process. Victorian illustration is fascinating to me and a big part of my experience of reading the literature from this time period, so it was really fun to do a bit of light research on this topic. All of the information in this video is synthesized from various articles on the Victorian web, which is a fascinating resource for all things Victorian, and which I'll link down below. And also, I watched an interesting lecture by Valerie Brown Lester called Fizz, Dickens, and London, which I'll link below as well. Personally, I'm really excited to read Dickens lately. I'm planning on participating in Katie from Books and Things' Mega Dickens Read-Along, where we are reading all of Dickens' work in publication order, and I think it'll be interesting to not only see how his novels and writing style evolve over time, but how the illustrations in his works evolve as well. So thank you for watching if you've made it to the end of what I imagine is a very long video. I'd love to hear your thoughts on Victorian illustration in general, or on the illustrations in Dickens's works specifically in the comments down below. What are some of your favorite Victorian illustrators or illustrations? And what do Victorian illustrations add to the reading experience for you personally? Until next time, I look forward to seeing you in another bookish video very soon. Bye!